Hey guys, tonight we begin with the daily lives of enslaved people in ancient Rome, and more specifically, what owners weren't allowed to do to them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Asking what Roman slave owners couldn't do is a bit like asking what a toddler can't do with a crayon and a white wall. Technically, there are rules. Realistically, chaos. Let's begin with legal definitions, because that always sets the mood. In ancient Rome, a slave wasn't a person. They were legally classified as res, which is Latin for thing. Not person with limited rights or underpaid intern. Just thing. Same legal category as a bench, or a decorative urn, or a goat with anxiety. And Roman owners treated them accordingly. You could beat a slave, sell them, rent them out, brand them, gamble them away, or re-gift them like an unwanted Saturnalia fruit basket. You could even send them to fight in the arena. Though, in fairness, some preferred that to folding laundry for a senatorial wife with trust issues. But despite this delightful buffet of absolute power, the Romans eventually realized that some boundaries might be helpful. Not because they discovered empathy, don't be ridiculous, but because murdering your workforce turns out to be a bit inefficient. Dead slaves can't serve wine, or pay taxes, or clean up the last dead slave, so laws appeared. Slowly, awkwardly, like a distant uncle at a wedding no one invited. The first limits were more like suggestions written in invisible ink. For instance, if your slave died under mysterious circumstances, like, say, from falling into a sword 17 times, there might be a trial, or not. Depends on who you knew. If you were important enough, you could claim he tripped during a very intense game of dice, and no one would blink. Eventually, emperors like Hadrian, the one who built the wall, not the razor, passed reforms saying you couldn't kill a slave without a good reason. That reason was almost always, he annoyed me. But hey, it was a start. In short, yes, there were some things owners couldn't do, but those things were buried under a mountain of things they could. Roman law technically protected slaves, the same way an umbrella protects you in a hurricane. In early Rome, if you felt like killing your slave, you didn't need a reason. Bad haircut? Eye contact at the wrong time? They brought you slightly warm wine? Off with their head. The law didn't flinch. After all, it wasn't murder if it involved property. And who hasn't wanted to destroy their property after a long day? But by the time the empire matured, around the same time Romans decided indoor plumbing was neat, things got a little more regulated. Not humanitarian, mind you, just organized. Killing your own slave began to carry legal consequences. Not necessarily bad consequences, but consequences nonetheless. Enter Emperor Hadrian, builder of walls, reformer of slave laws, and generally the kind of man who didn't like a scandal with his breakfast. He passed a law that said, hey, maybe let's not randomly murder the household staff, unless we ask nicely first. Owners now needed to go through a magistrate to get state approval before executing a slave, because nothing says justice like bureaucratic homicide. Of course, enforcement was spotty. If you were rich and well-connected, magistrates didn't question you. If you weren't, well, congratulations. Your trial would be held right after the next chariot race, and well before anyone actually cared. Still, it was technically illegal to kill a slave without a formal process, which means that somewhere at some point, some very stressed-out Roman lawyer had to explain to a client that yes, even if the slave overcooked the dormouse, public crucifixion was no longer a first response solution. The motivation behind this legal tweak wasn't compassion, it was crowd control. Romans had already seen what happened when slaves got too angry. Spartacus and his buddies didn't exactly throw a polite tea party, so the state figured that if they couldn't stop cruelty, they could at least reduce the kind of spectacle that leads to flaming torches and heads on pikes. So, while you could still kill your slave, it came with more paperwork and a higher risk of raised eyebrows from your senatorial neighbors. Murder wasn't banned. It was just gently discouraged, like clapping between symphony movements. Progress, Roman style. Let's talk about a dark, uncomfortable, but historically important topic. How Roman slave owners treated the personal boundaries of their enslaved people. Spoiler alert, boundaries were not exactly Rome's strong suit. These were people who built bathhouses for 300 and called it me time. In ancient Roman law, a slave was not considered a person in the full legal sense, and that meant the idea of bodily autonomy didn't really apply. Owners could impose themselves physically, not just through labor, but in more personal and private ways, without any need for consent, consequence, or moral justification. It wasn't written down explicitly in law because it didn't need to be. Just as you wouldn't find a law in ancient Rome telling people not to borrow their own sandals, there were no regulations about whether an owner could demand intimate services from a slave. It was simply assumed, disturbingly, universally, to be part of the package. This applied to all kinds of people. Women, men, and especially young slaves who were seen as aesthetic additions to elite households. These individuals were often placed in roles where their appearance and obedience were expected to entertain guests, and not always just with lute music or wine refills. Were there protections? Technically, if a different owner harmed your slave in a serious way, you could sue them for property damage. Yes, not for violation of the person, but for damage to the asset. The Roman courts were less concerned with dignity and more with depreciation. Later emperors, particularly under the Christian era, began issuing vague laws encouraging morality and modesty, at least on paper. But these reforms came late in the empire's history and were more about appearances than enforcement. If anything, they were the legal equivalent of putting a fig leaf on a statue and calling it progress. In short, there were virtually no boundaries protecting slaves from personal exploitation in this area. It wasn't just common, it was normalized, a system where even the act of resistance could be punished more harshly than the abuse itself. Yes, it's dark, but understanding these realities matters, not to glorify Rome, but to confront what power, when unchecked, can look like in its rawest form. Ah yes, marriage, the sacred union of two souls, or in Rome's case, the careful fusion of property rights, status calculations, and in-laws who might own gladiators. But what did this noble institution mean for slaves? Very little. Roman slaves couldn't legally marry. That's not to say they didn't fall in love, cohabitate, or raise children. They absolutely did. In fact, some long-term relationships among enslaved people were as committed as any Roman senator's fourth marriage, which, let's be honest, was usually more about inheritance than affection. But these unions weren't marriages in the eyes of Roman law. Instead, they were called contubernium, a word that sounds like something you'd put ointment on, but actually referred to a sort of unofficial domestic partnership. Think common law marriage, but without the law part, or the rights, or the privacy. Owners could permit these pairings, and sometimes even encouraged them, especially if the resulting offspring would be born into slavery and conveniently boost the household labor force. A 2-for-1 deal with a lifetime warranty. But the catch? At any moment, the master could end it. Sell one partner, reassign them, or marry them off elsewhere. A slave couple could live together for decades, raise children, and still be torn apart because someone needed a strong back in Sicily, and the other was good at mopping mosaics in Gaul. Did enslaved people petition for their partnerships to be respected? Sometimes. And in rare cases, especially when one or both partners were later freed, their union could be retroactively recognized. Like getting a marriage certificate years after the divorce. Heartwarming, right? To add another layer of awkwardness, owners themselves could marry their slaves via contubernum, though again, it wasn't legal marriage, just a deeply problematic mix of power dynamics, ownership, and what Romans might have called domestic convenience. Love stories, these were not. Imagine working in a house for 20 years, raising kids, scrubbing amphorae, fetching grapes, and then overhearing your master refer to you as that tall one with the limp. That's not just rude, it was Roman reality. In ancient Rome, a slave's identity was as malleable as clay in a potter's hands. If the potter were impatient, slightly power-mad, and didn't believe in last names. While slaves did have names, they were often given by their masters, changed arbitrarily, or stripped away altogether. Think of it as an ancient version of deleting someone's entire Google profile and replacing it with Steve number 4. You could be born with a beautiful Greek name like Callista, meaning most beautiful, and by the time you'd been sold twice and transferred across provinces, you'd be Spatula because someone thought it was funny. And unlike celebrities today, you didn't get to rebrand yourself. You couldn't request something elegant like Aurora or Maximus Prime. You got what you were given. Worse still, the Roman system didn't really recognize the full humanity of slaves in legal or social terms. You were defined not by your heritage, beliefs, or even your talents, but by your function. Were you good at cooking? You were cocus. Did you manage accounts? Dispensator. Did you mess up the laundry once? That idiot. Of course, if you were especially skilled or educated, say a Greek philosopher turned tutor for Roman brats, you might get a little respect. Maybe even keep your original name. But don't get comfortable. One bad day, and you'd be back to being number 12. Roman satire even mocked this, showing households where every slave had the same name, just to keep things simple for the owner. Davis, bring the wine. 5 men would show up. One would be punished for being too slow. The rest were punished preemptively, just in case. So, could Roman slave owners erase your name, your history, and your identity? Absolutely. The only thing harder than escaping slavery was escaping the nickname you got after that one time you sneezed on a senator. And if you ever did gain your freedom, well, good news, you got to keep your master's family name. Because nothing says freedom like being forever linked to the person who used to own you. Picture a Roman villa, marble columns, a fountain shaped like a sea god vomiting water, and in the back room, a slave teaching a senator's son how to recite Homer in flawless Greek. That's right. Not all slaves were forced to dig trenches or haul amphorae. Some were expected to drop knowledge, preferably in iambic hexameter. Education for enslaved people was a strange paradox. On one hand, slaves were legally considered property. On the other, some were expected to be walking encyclopedias, fluent in multiple languages, skilled in rhetoric, philosophy, medicine, even law. And no, there wasn't a pay bump, just a slightly reduced chance of being sold to someone worse. Greek slaves in particular were in high demand as tutors. Why? Because Rome had a huge cultural crush on Greece. Romans basically said, "We conquered you, but also, could you help our kids sound smarter at parties?" A Greek slave might be lecturing bored teenagers in Latin literature by day and fetching sandals by night. But let's not mistake this for generosity. Owners didn't educate slaves out of kindness. They educated them because an educated slave was an asset. If your household could produce a highly trained scribe, tutor, or physician, you didn't just get status points. You could charge your rich neighbors for his services. Education was less about enlightenment and more about ROI. Of course, this created some awkward power dynamics. Imagine being smarter than your master, but still having to ask permission to go outside. Many enslaved intellectuals walked a fine line between respected expert and talking bookshelf. Could a slave pursue knowledge on their own? Technically, yes, if they weren't too busy scrubbing floors or being rented out for birthday banquets. But any personal development had to serve the interests of the owner. No one was handing out library cards to slaves who just wanted to learn. There's even a famous case of Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher and former slave, who taught resilience and virtue, while literally being someone's property. That's ancient Rome for you. Know thyself, but only if your owner approves. Now we arrive at one of the thorniest legal puzzles of ancient Rome. Could a slave actually sue their master? Let's put it this way. Yes, in the same way a hamster might challenge its owner to chess. Technically possible, but you'd better hope your opponent is feeling uncharacteristically generous or very distracted. Roman law, in its infinite complexity, did allow a few paths for slaves to raise complaints against their masters. One option was the ius supplicandi, or the right to petition the emperor directly. A slave could throw themselves at the feet of imperial statues or public officials and beg for intervention. A bold move, especially considering the average slave wasn't exactly strutting around with pocket scrolls and legal training. In practice, these petitions were reserved for extreme abuse. We're talking physical brutality, sexual exploitation beyond even Rome's appallingly flexible standards, or dangerous neglect. If your master tried to light you on fire for forgetting the honey cakes, you might have a case. But forget to trim the laurel hedge? Tough luck, Decimus. Another quasi-legal route involved appealing to the aediles, Roman magistrates responsible for things like market regulation and public order. Some slaves who were hired out in marketplaces, often the more rentable types, think cooks, scribes, entertainers, could, in theory, lodge complaints about mistreatment by their temporary handlers. But again, this was less about justice and more about maintaining Rome's image as a city of order and dignity. Slaves could complain if they were treated so badly that it made Rome look bad. Otherwise, back to work. It's also worth noting that the infamous law of the lash, the right of masters to beat their slaves, had some blurry limits. A few emperors, including Hadrian, tried to clamp down on excessive cruelty. But excessive was relative. If the slave died under torture, you might get a frown from a local judge. If they just limped for life, you'd get a shrug. Ancient Rome wasn't exactly famous for kindness, but even in its vast catalogue of control, cruelty, and bureaucracy, there was one glimmering, dusty loophole: the possibility of manumission. That's the fancy Latin word for freedom. And believe it or not, it was something some slaves could actually achieve. So, what couldn't Roman slave owners do? They couldn't take away a slave's legal right to hope for freedom. Sure, they could beat you, rename you Moppicus, and make you serve wine at awkward dinner parties. But they couldn't deny you manumission once the legal path was open. Even in a system where people were considered property, Rome maintained a weirdly bureaucratic optimism about upward mobility, if you were lucky, loyal, and preferably literate. Slaves could be freed in a few different ways: by being formally manumitted in a legal ceremony, informally set free in a will, or even, if they were very good, granted freedom for exceptional service. It's basically like earning a gold star from your boss, except the reward is your entire life back. There were rules, of course. Rome loved rules. For instance, you couldn't just free a whole crowd of slaves at once. That would upset the social order. Too many people with dreams and clean togas? Dangerous. So there were quotas. A master with 3 slaves could only free 2 at a time, which feels less like justice and more like an ancient version of, you can pick one friend to come inside. Also, you couldn't free someone if you were in debt or legally incompetent. So yes, even slaves had to worry about their master's bad credit score. But here's the twist. Once freed, a slave became a freedman or freedwoman. They weren't full citizens, but they had rights, could own property, and yes, they could even own slaves themselves. Which is sort of like escaping prison, and then opening your own correctional facility. Still, this legal window, however small, gave enslaved people something no master could truly crush: a structured, lawful shot at freedom. Sure, it might take 20 years of impeccable obedience, no backtalk, and folding your master's tunic just right, but the hope was there. Barely. And in Rome, sometimes hope was all you got. That, and maybe a slightly less insulting nickname if you were lucky. At first glance, the Roman Republic was a place where a slave owner could do pretty much whatever they pleased. Slap, whip, rename you Bucketus, sell you at the market next to a donkey with a better dental plan. Standard stuff. But killing a slave? That was the one line that eventually Rome decided maybe shouldn't be crossed quite so casually. In the early days, a Roman paterfamilias, the all-powerful male head of the household, think dad but legally Zeus, could kill a slave without so much as a paperwork hiccup. Slaves were property after all. You don't get arrested for smashing your own vase. Even if that vase could talk, bleed, and knew your favorite bedtime story. But as the empire matured, and emperors realized that slaves were kind of the backbone of the economy, not to mention increasingly irreplaceable as tutors, accountants and barbers who didn't slit your throat, the laws began to shift ever so slightly. Under Emperor Hadrian, yes, the wall guy, things started changing. He ruled that masters could not kill their slaves without trial. This was not because Hadrian was a softie. It was because killing trained, skilled slaves was bad economics. A dead slave didn't earn fees, cut hair, or make funny faces for the dinner guests. Later, Antoninus Pius made it even clearer. If you killed a slave without proper cause, the state might treat it as a murder. That's right. Legal consequences. You couldn't just casually murder your cook for burning the garum sauce and expect to be congratulated. Now you might have to explain yourself. To a judge. In public. With togas involved. This didn't mean slave owners turned into gentle humanitarians overnight, but it did create a strange legal grey zone. Slaves couldn't sue their owners for slapping them into next week. But if the owner got too murdery, the state might step in. Why the change? Partly morality, partly money, mostly money. Rome realized that letting people destroy valuable human assets was bad for business. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of HR compliance training. In ancient Rome, if you were a free citizen and owned a slave, there was one thing the law technically forbade you from doing: marrying them. That's right. You could command them to scrub your back, name your children, and maybe even ghostwrite your poetry. But tying the knot? Scandalous. Roman marriage, connubium, was a civic institution reserved for free people. And since slaves were legally classified as property, yes, like a plough or a very tired horse, they weren't eligible for such high society ceremonies. No exchanging of rings, no awkward speeches from uncles, and definitely no romantic honeymoons in Pompeii. But this is Rome we're talking about. Where there's a loophole, there's a way. So while formal marriage was off the table, owners could enter into a de facto relationship with their slaves, especially if said slave was attractive, talented, or exceptionally good at pouring wine. These arrangements were common, even mundane. Romans even had a term for it: contubernium, or tent sharing. It sounded more like a camping trip, but it was essentially a long-term domestic partnership, with slightly fewer legal rights and slightly more power imbalance. In these relationships, the slave remained property, but might live with the owner, bear their children, and effectively function as a spouse in all but paperwork. The kids? If the mother was a slave, they were slaves too. Talk about a legacy plan with strings attached. However, if the master really cared, or grew worried about public image, inheritance laws, or maybe just had a pang of conscience, they could free the slave and then marry them. A legal workaround. Of course, this required paperwork, manumission fees, and probably a very awkward conversation at the next elite dinner party. Ah yes, Gaius married his housemaid. No, after he freed her. Very proper. They're registered now. Got her a nice name too. Julia something or other. In a society obsessed with status, marrying a former slave was a social gamble. It could be frowned upon, even ridiculed. But legally, once freed, she was fair game. You could have been the brightest slave in Rome, fluent in Greek, skilled in accounting, able to recite Cicero backwards while juggling amphorae, and still, you would never be allowed to run for public office. Not even something boring like street lantern supervisor, because despite being the backbone of Roman society, slaves weren't considered full humans in the legal sense, more like highly durable, multilingual furniture. And Rome, ever obsessed with dignity, dignitas, decided that its political offices should only be filled by freeborn men, preferably those with a certain number of ancestors who hadn't been forcibly bought. This meant slave owners couldn't shove their cleverest slave into the Senate, no matter how much better they were at rhetoric than the local patrician who still thought the Punic Wars were ongoing. The logic? Public office was a privilege of libertas, full Roman freedom. It was tied to honor, family name, and usually an unhealthy obsession with togas, and while slaves could serve public officials, and often did, sometimes running entire estates or managing finances behind the scenes, they could never hold the title themselves. Even freedmen, those former slaves who had clawed their way up into partial citizenship, were still barred from many high-ranking positions. They might own land, start businesses, and wear less itchy tunics, but the Roman establishment still viewed them with suspicion. You were pouring wine for a senator last year, and now you want to be one? Let's not get carried away. But here's the kicker. Many wealthy Romans relied heavily on their highly educated slaves to do the actual work. Need a speech written? Send it to your Greek slave. Need a library managed? Your slave copyists got it. Need a bribe handled discreetly? Who better than someone who legally doesn't exist in court? Still, the slave himself, no matter how brilliant, could never rise to public power until he was freed. It was the ancient equivalent of being the ghostwriter for a best-selling book, but never allowed to sign your name on the cover. So no, masters couldn't legally turn their slaves into consuls or censors, though they could, and often did, let them manage everything except the spotlight. Because Rome was fine with slaves being the brains behind the curtain, just so long as no one noticed. Now, you might assume that if a slave witnessed a murder in ancient Rome, the courts would rush to hear their valuable testimony, cross-examine them gently, and offer a complimentary glass of watered-down wine. But Rome had other ideas. In Roman law, slaves were not allowed to testify under oath, not because their memory was bad, or because they didn't know who stabbed who at dinner, but because they were considered too untrustworthy to speak the truth unless you first beat it out of them. Yes, you read that right. In Rome, the standard method of obtaining a slave's testimony in court was torture, because nothing screams justice like screaming witnesses. Roman jurists believed that slaves would lie to protect their masters, which, to be fair, isn't entirely wrong when your entire existence depends on the whims of the guy who owns your bed, body, and breakfast. So instead of relying on good faith, they relied on hot irons, lashes, and other medieval-sounding instruments, several centuries before the Middle Ages even began. This led to a legal paradox. Slaves couldn't be forced to testify in their master's favor, and if they were willing to, well, that was suspicious too. So the courts preferred to motivate honesty with pain. It's not exactly the Socratic method. Now, you might wonder, were there any exceptions? Yes, occasionally, if a slave had been freed, or if the matter didn't involve their master directly, they could testify voluntarily. But if the trial involved the owner, forget it. The assumption was always, they'll lie unless we twist their arm. Literally. This wasn't just cruel. It was wildly inconsistent. Imagine trying to build a case using a witness who couldn't testify unless they were mid-scream. It's a bit like asking a parrot to sing the national anthem, but only while being electrocuted. You might get something, but probably not justice. So, in theory, slave owners couldn't legally force their slaves to give honest court testimony. not unless they dragged them in and let the state do the torturing, which, oddly, was considered a form of neutral investigation. Because in ancient Rome, Lady Justice didn't wear a blindfold. She just didn't want to hear it unless it came with a side of bruises. Despite being considered legal property, slaves in ancient Rome had a surprising degree of economic wiggle room. Imagine being treated like a talking lamp, but allowed to run a side hustle selling homemade olive oil on the weekends. That's the Roman paradox. While masters owned their slaves, they didn't necessarily micromanage every coin they touched. Slaves could accumulate personal savings, known as a peculium, a kind of unofficial allowance, tip jar, or under the mattress stash that technically still belonged to the master, but was often left untouched, so long as the slave wasn't using it to fund a rebellion or a spa day. And here's where things get delightfully awkward for Roman control freaks. Slaves could use this peculium to eventually buy their own freedom. Yes, a slave could pay their master to stop owning them. It's a bit like working full-time for a guy who locks you in the cellar and using your paycheck to politely bribe him into unlocking the door. Hello, sir. I've saved up by running errands and surviving, and I'd like to no longer be your property. Here's your receipt. Now, was this a right? Not exactly. Roman law didn't guarantee manumission, and the master could refuse the offer if he felt especially petty or had grown overly fond of yelling orders. But many masters accepted it, because they liked the idea of looking merciful and getting paid. This created a strange dynamic. The master couldn't legally prevent a slave from accumulating money, as long as it was through legitimate means. Nor could they seize the peculium without cause, unless they wanted to appear dishonorable. And in Roman society, appearing dishonorable was worse than being mildly stabbed. Some slaves even managed estates, handled business accounts, or ran shops, meaning they knew more about the economy than their owners, who were often too busy lounging in togas and misquoting Virgil. Of course, a master could still revoke the peculium at any time, but doing so too often made them look cheap, like someone who steals tips off the dinner table. So most played it cool. Thus, while masters held all the cards, they couldn't quite stop a clever slave from slowly stacking their own deck. If you think ancient Rome gave slave owners absolute power over every part of a slave's life, you'd be almost right, except when it came to religion. Because even in a society where a man could legally name his dog Caesar and sell his slave 3 times for tax reasons, there were limits. And one of those limits was this: a master could not completely block a slave's participation in religious observances, especially those involving the household gods, or lares. Now, these weren't high-profile deities like Jupiter or Mars, who got all the thunderbolts and statues. No, these were humble domestic spirits, kind of like divine smoke alarms, whose job was to keep the home peaceful and the kitchen from catching fire. And every Roman household, no matter how dysfunctional, had a shrine to them. Even slaves were expected, and sometimes required, to participate in daily rituals honoring the lares. Lighting a little incense, saying a prayer, offering some food. Just your standard, please don't let this house collapse today kind of stuff. Denying a slave access to these basic rites would have been seen as weird, like banning someone from singing Happy Birthday at their own party. Roman religion was as much about tradition and public image as it was about actual belief. And having your slaves participate in the rituals showed that your household was orderly, pious, and not on the brink of divine retribution. Plus, let's be honest, even the harshest master didn't want to tick off the household gods. These were spirits who watched you eat, sleep, and occasionally yell at your accountant. You didn't risk that kind of supernatural micromanagement just to make a point. In fact, some slaves had their own household gods, lares serviles, and small personal rituals. It was one of the few places in Roman life where a slave could express something close to identity, or at least try to prevent another plumbing disaster. So while a master could control most aspects of a slave's body and labor, when it came to appeasing the local spirits, they generally stepped back. After all, in Rome, even divine beings had their professional boundaries. For all their power, prestige, and terrifyingly large busts on coins, Roman slave owners had one major Achilles heel: public embarrassment. You see, in Roman society, dignitas, one's honor, reputation, and general image as a respectable toga wearer, mattered more than gold, goats, or military victories combined. And nothing chipped away at that precious social armor quite like being dragged into scandal involving the people who literally cleaned your chamber pot. This meant that, legally or not, there were things owners simply didn't do to their slaves, not because they suddenly developed ethics, but because the Roman public could be extremely judgmental. The mob, the Senate, even your dinner guests could ruin you faster than a badly timed vomitorium incident. Take, for example, the case of a Roman noble who punished his entire household of slaves for a crime committed by one. It technically was legal at the time, collective punishment was a thing, but the backlash was so severe, the Senate considered passing laws to prevent such excesses in the future. Roman Twitter, also known as shouting in the forum, was not having it. And don't forget the power of infamia. A legal and social stain that could stick to a master who was too cruel, too exploitative, or just too loud about how awful they were. If you ended up being that guy who whipped his slaves for mispronouncing Latin, your reputation might end up worse than a disgraced charioteer, and with fewer fangirls. In fact, being perceived as a good or merciful master became a weird sort of flex. Masters would stage acts of kindness, freeing a slave in public, granting a peculium, letting one marry, just to show off their moral compass, which was usually spinning like a drunken centurion. In the Mongol Empire, a Khan's harem was never just a private collection of lovers. It was a living emblem of empire. Imagine a vast tent complex or palace chamber filled with women from every corner of Eurasia, each chosen not only for beauty, but for what her presence represented. To the Mongols, concubines were as much about politics as they were about pleasure. They were walking trophies of conquest, tangible reminders that the Khan's authority reached far beyond the steppes. A harem could contain dozens, sometimes even hundreds of women, ranging from noble daughters of rival rulers to slaves captured during raids. Each arrival sent a message. If the Khan had the daughter of a Persian prince or a Chinese governor in his court, it wasn't just about companionship, it was a declaration of dominance. It meant the Mongols didn't simply defeat armies. They absorbed their enemies into their households, their bloodlines, even their future dynasties. This wasn't unique to the Mongols. Many empires kept harems, but the scale and symbolism here were unmatched. For nomadic rulers, who built legitimacy not on palaces or marble cities, but on conquest and charisma, the harem was a portable display of prestige. To foreign ambassadors, walking into the Khan's court and seeing women from their homeland seated among others was both awe-inspiring and humiliating. It was a reminder that the Khan could command loyalty, tribute, and even intimacy from lands thousands of miles away. Concubines also blurred the line between politics and family. Some women faded into anonymity, living quiet lives within the harem walls. But others rose to prominence, wielding influence through charm, cunning, or motherhood. A concubine who bore a son could see her fortunes transformed overnight, her child potentially standing in line for succession. In this way, harems became miniature political arenas, with rivalries, alliances, and betrayals unfolding as intensely as they did on the battlefield. For the Mongols, war was not only about territory, it was about reshaping societies, down to the bodies of the people they conquered. When the horsemen thundered into Persia, Russia, or northern China, they didn't just take gold, livestock, and prisoners of war. They also selected women, sometimes by the dozens, sometimes by the hundreds, who would be swept into the Khan's harem. To the Mongols, the capture of women was more than a spoil of war. It was an instrument of domination, Take, for instance, the campaigns of Genghis Khan. After defeating rival tribes, he made a point of claiming highborn women for himself and his family. These weren't random abductions, they were deliberate choices. A princess from a rival clan wasn't simply beautiful. She was a piece of political leverage. By sleeping under the same roof as the Khan, she ensured that her lineage was absorbed, symbolically and sometimes literally, into the Mongol world order. It was a brutal kind of diplomacy, one that mixed conquest with forced intimacy. But capture didn't always mean elevation. For every noblewoman taken as a concubine, countless others, peasants, servants, slaves, were swept into the lower ranks of the harem. Some were destined for lives of obscurity, their names never recorded, their roles reduced to the endless cycle of serving, entertaining, and being forgotten. To them, conquest meant the erasure of identity, replaced by the anonymity of being one among many. Still, the presence of these women reinforced the empire's reach. A harem in Karakoram, or later in Beijing, could resemble a living map of Mongol victories. You might see a Turkic beauty from Samarkand, a Song courtier from Hangzhou, a Russian captive from Ryazan, and a Persian noble from Isfahan, all seated in the same hall, speaking different languages, bound by the same fate. Each one was proof that no wall, city, or dynasty was beyond Mongol power. And yet, amidst this brutality, opportunity sometimes flickered. A concubine with intelligence and ambition could rise above her station, catching the Khan's eye and securing influence for herself or her family. Conquest created victims, yes, but it also created unlikely players in the grand game of empire. The harem was not just a prison. In rare cases, it was a ladder, albeit one built from violence and subjugation. Not every woman in the Mongol harems was taken by force. Sometimes they arrived wrapped in silks, accompanied by servants, and presented like jewels in a box. These were the daughters and sisters of kings, governors, and khans, who chose survival over resistance. Sending a woman to the Mongol court was a grim but practical form of diplomacy, one that often meant the difference between keeping a throne and watching it burn. For rulers facing the unstoppable cavalry, tribute wasn't just gold or horses. A daughter could be the ultimate peace offering, a human shield against the wrath of Mongol armies. Imagine the scene. An envoy entering the court of Ogadai or Kublai, bowing low and offering the most prized possession of his household, a royal woman dressed to display her wealth and heritage. In that moment, she became both a hostage and a bridge, a living treaty that tied her homeland to the empire's will. The Mongols understood the weight of such gestures. A concubine given as tribute wasn't just a wife or servant. She was proof that another ruler accepted Mongol supremacy. The Khan could look across his harem and literally see the submission of nations. Each woman carried the story of her people's survival, or their surrender. But here's the cruel irony. While some women wielded quiet diplomatic significance, they were still bound by the harem's hierarchy. A princess from a powerful kingdom might enjoy privileges, fine clothing, and a voice in court affairs, but her life was not her own. Her presence reminded her homeland of its vulnerability and the delicate balance of loyalty it owed to the Mongol throne. At times, these women even acted as informal ambassadors. Through letters, gifts, and whispered influence, they maintained contact with their families, subtly steering diplomacy from behind veils and screens. Some used their positions to protect their people, bargaining for lighter tribute demands or leniency during rebellions. Others became pawns, used as leverage when their kin failed to deliver on promises. Tribute through women was the perfect combination of symbolism and pragmatism for the Mongols. It reinforced their dominance without shedding a drop of blood. And for the rulers who sent them, it was both a humiliation and a desperate hope that by sacrificing one daughter, they might save an entire kingdom. Behind the walls of the Mongol harem, life unfolded in ways both lavish and suffocating. These were not simple households, but sprawling, tightly organized institutions. The harem might be physically located in a tent complex on the steppe, or inside a palace in cities like Karakoram, or later Kanbalik. Yet the atmosphere was always the same, layered with rules, rituals, and rivalries. Women were ranked according to origin and favor. At the top stood royal consorts, often wives taken through formal marriage alliances. Below them came high-born concubines, often daughters of defeated rulers or tribute princesses. At the bottom were the nameless masses, slaves, entertainers, and servants swept up during raids. Every woman knew her position, and every woman knew that it could change, sometimes with a single glance from the Khan. Daily life was a paradox. On one hand, there was luxury, silks from China, jewels from Persia, perfumes from India. Meals were rich with game, dairy, and exotic imports. The harem itself was often guarded by eunuchs or loyal retainers, ensuring both security and secrecy. Yet beneath the glitter, life could feel like gilded captivity. Women lived cut off from the outside world, their movements controlled, their futures dependent on the Khan's whims. Still, this cloistered environment was far from quiet. The harem was its own political battleground. Concubines schemed to catch the Khan's attention, forging alliances with servants or undermining rivals with whispered rumors. A concubine who bore a son suddenly found herself propelled into a higher status. Her child might even be groomed for leadership. On the other hand, a woman who fell from favor could vanish into obscurity, her name erased from court records. Yet not all influence came through seduction or children. Some women wielded power through intellect, charm, or sheer resilience. They advised, listened, and sometimes manipulated, turning the harem into a subtle arena of diplomacy. From behind veils, they could influence decisions that affected kingdoms, military campaigns, or the succession itself. For outsiders, the harem remained a world of mystery, filled with both opulence and danger. For those inside, it was a delicate game of survival. To thrive meant mastering silence, patience, and strategy. In many ways, life in the Mongol harem mirrored the empire itself, ruthless, expansive, and always balanced on the edge of opportunity and ruin. If the battlefield was where Mongol generals clashed, the harem was where their concubines waged silent wars of their own. Within its walls, rivalries simmered, alliances formed, and whispers often carried more weight than swords. A single smile from the Khan could spark jealousy, while a passing insult might spiral into years of quiet scheming. At the core of these rivalries was status. To be favored by the Khan meant better quarters, finer clothes, and most importantly, influence. Concubines competed not only for affection, but also for the chance to secure a future for their children. A son born of a favored concubine could one day become a prince, or even a Khan. That possibility alone turned every birth into a high-stakes event, and every pregnancy into a battle with consequences stretching across the empire. But ambition in the harem wasn't limited to motherhood. Some women sought to build alliances with eunuchs, guards, or senior wives, leveraging these connections for survival or advantage. Others mastered the subtle art of information, knowing which rival had lost favor, which envoy had sent gifts, or which servant could be bribed to deliver a message at just the right moment. In a world where voices were often ignored, knowledge was a currency far more valuable than silver. Yet, these intrigues could also be deadly. A whisper of betrayal, a rumor of infidelity, or an accusation of witchcraft could destroy a concubine standing overnight. History hints at women who mysteriously disappeared, their fates unrecorded, likely victims of palace politics. To outsiders, the harem seemed like a paradise of beauty and luxury. To those within, it could feel like a chessboard, where every move had to be calculated, and every misstep could mean ruin. What makes these rivalries fascinating is that they mirrored the empire's larger struggles. Just as Mongol princes vied for succession and generals plotted their next campaign, the concubines maneuvered within their confined world for influence, security, and recognition. Their rivalries weren't just petty squabbles. They were reflections of the Mongol court itself, condensed into the lives of women forced to play the game of survival with stakes as high as any battlefield. In this sense, the harem was not merely a private space. It was an echo chamber of the empire's politics, where intrigue thrived and rivalries shaped destinies. If concubinage was a game of chance, then motherhood was the ultimate jackpot. In the Mongol Empire, bearing a son didn't just elevate a concubine's rank, it transformed her into a power broker. The moment a child cried within the harem walls, the woman who gave birth could rise overnight from relative obscurity to a position of genuine influence. Mongol politics revolved heavily around bloodlines, and every Khan was deeply invested in producing heirs. Official wives often held seniority, but concubines who bore sons could rival them in authority. A single birth could tilt the balance of succession, fueling rivalries that extended beyond the harem into the court and battlefield. Suddenly, generals, ministers, and even foreign envoys had to pay attention to a woman who, just weeks earlier, might have been overlooked. Mothers of princes had unique responsibilities. They were expected to oversee their child's upbringing, ensure loyalty among servants, and sometimes even act as political advisors. While a boy was raised in the warrior traditions of the steppe, his mother remained the guardian of his early education, shaping his values and allegiances. Some concubines became fierce advocates for their sons, maneuvering to secure lands, armies, and titles for them, but the stakes were brutally high. If a concubine's son failed, was sidelined, or lost a succession battle, both mother and child could face ruin, or worse. The Mongol Empire was infamous for its violent succession struggles, with princes clashing in bloody conflicts that tore families apart. For the women who bore them, survival meant not only protecting their child, but also navigating the vicious rivalries between competing mothers. Some mothers achieved lasting power. Historical whispers suggest that certain concubines became kingmakers, influencing which son was chosen as heir. Through whispers, gifts, and quiet persuasion, they could shape the destiny of the empire itself. Others faded into obscurity once their sons died young or failed to claim a place among the ruling elite. In the Mongol harem, to be a mother was both a blessing and a curse. It offered the only real path to influence for most concubines, yet it tied their fate entirely to a child's success. In a world where princes lived with daggers at their backs, motherhood was as much a gamble as it was a triumph. Concubines in the Mongol Empire weren't just women living behind veils and walls. They were symbols, carefully curated pieces of propaganda that reinforced the Khan's supremacy. Every concubine represented a story: the capture of a city, the submission of a rival, or the survival of a diplomatic treaty. To look at a Mongol harem was to see the empire itself reflected in human form. Imagine the scene: a court gathering where foreign envoys entered the Khan's palace. They were led past rooms filled with women of unmistakably different origins: Turkic, Chinese, Persian, Russian, Korean. Each bore the distinct marks of her homeland: embroidered robes, jewels shaped in regional styles, or hairstyles that spoke of far-off traditions. To the Mongols, this diversity was not chaos, but proof that their authority spanned continents. The harem was a living atlas, each woman a pin on the map of conquest. This symbolism worked on multiple levels. Domestically, it reminded Mongol nobles of the Khan's unmatched power. He commanded not only men and armies, but also the beauty and bloodlines of conquered peoples. For foreign diplomats, the message was even sharper. Your land may still exist, but your daughters are here. The Khan doesn't just rule territories, He rules families, futures, and dynasties. The presence of concubines also reinforced the Mongol image of themselves as world rulers chosen by the eternal blue sky. Just as the empire absorbed craftsmen, scholars, and generals from all corners of Eurasia, so too did it absorb women. The harem was not an indulgence. It was a microcosm of universal rule, echoing the belief that the Mongols were destined to govern the entire world. Of course, this symbolism weighed heavily on the women themselves. Many were stripped of their identities, renamed and refashioned into ornaments of empire. Yet, for some, that role came with opportunities. A concubine might subtly leverage her position as a representative of her homeland, advocating for her people or shaping policies in their favor. In this way, the harem became both a prison and a stage, where women played unwilling but crucial roles in empire building. Concubines were never mere companions. They were living trophies, symbols of conquest, and reminders of the Mongols' relentless hunger for domination. In their faces, the world could see the cost of empire. For every concubine who rose to prominence, dozens more slipped quietly into obscurity. The Mongol harems were vast, sometimes housing hundreds of women, and most lived their lives unseen by history. Their names were rarely recorded, their faces forgotten, their stories erased by the sheer scale of empire. For these women, survival, not influence, was the highest achievement. Life for the lesser concubines was marked by routine and invisibility. They performed tasks within the harem, sewing, weaving, preparing food, or entertaining through music and dance. Many never saw the Khan beyond a distant glimpse, let alone shared his bed. For them, the grandeur of the harem was less about opulence and more about monotony. Days blended together, punctuated only by the small dramas of rivalry, illness, or the occasional promotion when a favored concubine fell from grace. Yet obscurity was often safer than ambition. To strive for influence meant attracting enemies, and in the harem, enemies could be fatal. Rumors of witchcraft, disloyalty, or disrespect could condemn a woman to exile, or worse. In contrast, those who kept their heads down, who blended into the background, often endured long lives within the harem's protective walls. Their anonymity was a shield against the dangers of intrigue. Still, survival carried its own costs. These women were uprooted from their homelands, stripped of their languages and traditions, and remade into silent fixtures of the Mongol court. They lived lives disconnected from their families, knowing they would never return to their native lands. For some, the memory of home faded into fragments. A lullaby half remembered, a recipe long forgotten, a childhood story they could no longer tell in their original tongue. And yet, survival in itself was a victory. The Mongol Empire was an unforgiving world, filled with brutal campaigns and ruthless politics. A concubine who lived quietly in the harem outlasted soldiers, generals, and even princes who perished in endless wars. While history ignored them, these women carried the resilience of endurance. Their lives remind us that not all history is written in bold strokes of conquest and power. Sometimes it is written in silence, in the quiet persistence of those who endured without leaving their names behind. In the shadow of empire, survival was its own kind of triumph. The story of concubinage in the Mongol Empire is not just a tale of harems, luxury, or intrigue. It is a mirror reflecting the very mechanics of empire, how power was displayed, how politics were negotiated, and how women became both pawns and players in a world dominated by conquest. For the Khans, concubines were more than companions. They were symbols of legitimacy, tokens of diplomacy, and proof that no kingdom or people could resist Mongol will. A harem filled with women from across Eurasia was a living monument, one that told every visitor, "This empire stretches farther than you can imagine." In this sense, the practice of concubinage shaped the image of Mongol rule as universal, destined, and unstoppable. For the women themselves, however, the legacy was complex. Some concubines rose to prominence, shaping dynastic succession and influencing imperial policy. Their children became princes, generals, and heirs to thrones. These women, often forgotten by name, quietly steered the fate of the empire through their proximity to power. Yet, for every woman who found influence, countless others endured lives of obscurity, their voices lost in the shadows of the harem. What lingers is the duality of their existence: symbols and survivors, political tools and human beings. They remind us that history is not only written by generals and khans, but also by those who lived within their orbits. Even when unnamed, concubines embodied the empire's ambitions and bore the hidden costs of its expansion. The practice of concubinage also left echoes that stretched beyond the Mongols. Later dynasties in China, Persia, and Central Asia adopted or expanded harem systems that owed much to Mongol precedent. The idea of women as instruments of power, as both spoils and guarantors of political order, became woven into the political culture of Eurasia long after the empire itself dissolved. Ultimately, concubinage in the Mongol Empire forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Behind the grandeur of conquest were lives shaped by captivity, ambition, and survival. The Khans rode across continents, reshaping the world, but the women in their harems carried that story in their bodies and their silence. They were the human cost of empire and its most enduring symbols. Step into Victorian London, and the first thing you notice isn't the grandeur of its architecture or even the smog that hung over the city. It's the food smells. Every major street, alley, and marketplace doubled as a kitchen. Food wasn't confined to pubs or genteel tea rooms. It spilled out into the streets, carried on carts with squeaky wheels, balanced in baskets on the arms of hawkers, and sizzling over small charcoal braziers right on the pavement. For working-class Londoners, who rarely had access to their own ovens, this street economy was a lifeline. Most households in the slums didn't have the luxury of a full kitchen. Even boiling water could be a struggle. Street food filled that gap. A few pennies could buy a hot, filling meal that spared families the need to cook in cramped, smoke-choked rooms. To eat from the street was not a treat. It was a necessity. The streets themselves became theatres of food. Hawkers shouted rhymes and catchy cries to draw customers. Hot pies all hot, or chestnuts all warm. These weren't just sales pitches. They were part of the city's soundtrack, mingling with horse hooves, factory whistles, and the hum of thousands moving through London's arteries. To walk down Cheapside, Whitechapel, or the Strand was to pass through a symphony of smells and sounds, each hawker vying for attention. But there was another side to this bustling kitchen: hygiene, or rather the lack of it. Food was often prepared in bulk under questionable conditions, carried in open baskets, or set out on stalls where coal soot and flies had free rein. Still, for many Londoners, the choice wasn't between clean and dirty. It was between eating something questionable or going hungry. At its core, Victorian street food culture reflected the rhythms of the city itself. It was fast, cheap, loud, and always within reach. From the dock worker grabbing a meat pie between shifts, to children pooling coins for a shared bag of roasted potatoes, the streets provided what kitchens could not. In a society stratified by wealth and class, the food hawkers of London blurred the lines, feeding everyone who had a penny to spare. The streets weren't just a place to walk, they were where the city ate. If there was one undisputed monarch of Victorian street food, it was the hot pie. To the weary labourer trudging home from a 10-hour shift, or the clerk hurrying down the Strand, nothing satisfied hunger faster or cheaper than a steaming pie pulled fresh from a hawker's portable oven. These pies weren't dainty pastries fit for drawing rooms. They were sturdy, handheld meals designed for one thing: survival on the go. The pies came in every imaginable form. Meat pies were the standard, though meat could be a generous term. Some were stuffed with minced beef or mutton, but cheaper versions often used scraps of gristle, offal, or even questionable fillers padded out with potatoes or turnips. For a penny, you didn't ask too many questions, you just hoped for something warm and filling. More affluent customers might buy a veal and oyster pie, a delicacy that combined luxury with affordability, showing how street food could cater to both the working poor and the upwardly mobile middle class. Street pie sellers were everywhere, wheeling around tin ovens that kept their wares hot. These contraptions looked like miniature fireplaces on wheels, smoke curling up as the hawker cried out, "Pies all hot, piping hot!" The cries became part of London's identity, instantly recognizable to anyone navigating the city's crowded lanes. Some sellers even built loyal followings, known by name and trusted for their pie's relative quality, compared to less reputable competitors. But for all their popularity, hot pies also had a darker reputation. Reformers and journalists frequently raised alarms about food adulteration in Victorian London, and pies were often at the centre of suspicion. The press loved horror stories of cat or dog meat finding its way into fillings, playing into anxieties about the city's murky food supply. While many such tales were exaggerated, they reveal the tension between the joy of a warm meal and the uncertainty of what exactly one was eating. Still, the hot pie endured because it met the needs of the age. In a city exploding with people, factories, and long hours, the pie was portable, hearty, and cheap. It wasn't fine dining, but it was democratic, a meal that filled bellies and fueled the Victorian workforce. In many ways, it was the quintessential taste of London's streets. If hot pies reigned supreme year-round, roasted chestnuts claimed their own seasonal crown in Victorian London. As the days shortened and the fog thickened, the sharp, smoky scent of chestnuts roasting over open braziers drifted through the streets. It was the smell of winter in the city, wrapping itself around pedestrians like an edible perfume. Chestnut sellers set up on corners and busy thoroughfares, their simple stalls marked by little iron pans or braziers glowing with hot coals. For a penny, you could walk away with a warm paper cone filled with chestnuts, their shells charred, their flesh soft and nutty. For poor Londoners with numb fingers and empty stomachs, the chestnut wasn't just food, it was heat. Customers warmed their hands on the cone before eating, a small but precious comfort in the damp, bone-chilling cold of Victorian winters. The trade itself was often run by the very poor, many of them women and children. For some, selling chestnuts was the only barrier between their families and starvation. It required little equipment, just a brazier, fuel, and a supply of nuts, and could be operated anywhere crowds gathered. Railway stations, markets, and theatre districts were prime spots, with sellers catching customers as they poured out of evening shows. Chestnuts also carried a reputation as one of the safer street foods. Unlike pies, which could hide anything within their crusts, chestnuts were roasted in their shells right before your eyes. They didn't require complicated storage, and they were hard to adulterate. Reformers who railed against food impurities sometimes held up chestnuts as an example of honest street fare, simple, clean, and nourishing. Yet even here, there were hints of hardship. Sellers often worked long hours in freezing weather, their faces smudged with coal dust, their hands calloused from handling hot pans. For customers, the warm cone was fleeting comfort. For sellers, it was survival, 1 penny at a time. The popularity of roasted chestnuts was such that they became part of Victorian literature and art. Charles Dickens himself immortalised them, describing how their aroma filled London's wintry streets. More than just a snack, they symbolised the shared humanity of the city. A food cheap enough for the poor, yet fragrant and festive enough to be enjoyed by the middle classes. In a city defined by inequality, roasted chestnuts were one of the few treats that crossed all social boundaries. If roasted chestnuts carried the charm of winter evenings, then eel stalls embodied the grit of working-class London. For the city's poorest residents, eels weren't just another street snack. They were survival food, cheap and endlessly available. With the Thames teeming with the slippery creatures, eels became one of the most democratic staples of Victorian street cuisine. Eel sellers set up rough wooden stalls or operated from carts, displaying trays of the wriggling fish, sometimes still alive, sometimes already chopped into sections and stewing in large iron pots. For a few pennies, a hungry labourer could buy a serving of jellied eels, boiled until their natural gelatin set into a wobbly, glistening mass. For those with a stronger stomach, stewed eels simmered in pepper and vinegar offered a richer, more savoury taste. Either way, they provided protein at a price no butcher could match. The stalls themselves were magnets for the working poor. Dock workers, factory hands, and costermongers crowded around them, scooping up portions eaten standing or carried home in little basins. Unlike pies or chestnuts, which were snacks, eels were a meal, cheap, filling, and sustaining enough to carry a man through another exhausting day. But eel stalls weren't just about food. They were social spaces. Men and women rubbed shoulders here, exchanging gossip, news, or jokes while spooning down their bowls. The air was heavy with the tang of vinegar, the bubbling sound of pots, and the cries of hawkers shouting prices. In a city where class divisions cut deep, eel stalls were one of the few places where poverty was openly visible yet communal, where survival had its own camaraderie. The popularity of eel stalls also reflected the precariousness of Victorian diets. Meat was expensive, bread was often adulterated with chalk or alum, and vegetables could be scarce in poor neighbourhoods. Eels filled the gap, offering nourishment where other foods failed. Their abundance in the Thames kept costs low, though overfishing and pollution would later tarnish this abundance. To outsiders, eel stalls may have seemed unappealing, even grotesque, but to countless Londoners, they were lifelines, offering not just calories, but community. In many ways, they defined the very essence of Victorian street food: practical, affordable, and unapologetically tied to the rhythms of survival. If hot pies and eels fed the stomach, penny ice creams and sugary street snacks fed the soul. By the mid-19th century, London's streets rang not only with the cries of savoury food hawkers, but also with the cheerful calls of sellers promising a moment of sweetness for just a copper coin. For children and adults alike, these treats offered a brief escape from the grind of daily life. The most famous indulgence was penny ice cream. Long before refrigeration was common, street vendors carried ice mixed with saltpeter to keep their confections cold. Ice cream was scooped into small reusable glasses, sometimes rinsed only briefly before being handed to the next eager customer. It wasn't luxurious Italian gelato, but for a penny, Londoners didn't complain. Flavours ranged from lemon and strawberry to questionable mixtures of milk and sugar syrup, churned into something resembling ice cream. Despite its dubious hygiene, penny ice was wildly popular, especially in summer when it turned crowded streets into impromptu carnivals. But ice cream was far from the only sweet treat on offer. Hawkers sold toffee drops, treacle sticks, candied nuts, and sticks of peppermint rock. Licorice roots were chewed by children whose parents couldn't spare more than a halfpenny. Vendors with trays strapped to their shoulders wove through busy streets, jingling bells or shouting sing-song cries to announce their presence. The sight of children pressing their noses against trays of sweets became a familiar image in the city. These sugary snacks carried a powerful symbolism in Victorian London. For the poor, they were luxuries within reach, tiny indulgences that made deprivation easier to bear. For reformers, however, they were signs of moral decay, tempting children with cheap pleasures and distracting them from thrift and discipline. Newspapers occasionally published warnings about adulterated candies coloured with poisonous dyes, adding another layer of anxiety to the sweet trade. Yet the popularity of penny ice creams and sugary snacks persisted because they spoke to something deeper than hunger. They offered joy, however fleeting. In neighbourhoods where children worked as street sellers themselves, hawking matches or newspapers, a penny spent on ice cream was not just about taste. It was about childhood, in a city that often denied them one. Sugary treats may not have been nourishing, But they were essential in another way. They fed hope, delight, and the human craving for small pleasures amid hardship. Street food in Victorian London wasn't only about eating, it was about drinking too. Alongside the cries of pie sellers and the hiss of roasting chestnuts came the clinking of bottles and the steam rising from kettles. Beverages were an essential part of street culture, offering refreshment, warmth, or in some cases, a cheap buzz. One of the most popular drinks was ginger beer. Unlike modern sodas, Victorian ginger beer was often fermented, meaning it carried a mild alcoholic kick. Sold in sturdy stoneware bottles with cork stoppers, it was tangy, fizzy, and just sweet enough to appeal to children and adults alike. Hawkers sold it from carts or shops that specialised in nothing but this spicy brew. For the working poor, ginger beer offered a refreshing alternative to water, which was often unsafe to drink. Its effervescence made it feel indulgent, even if it was only a penny a glass. Coffee stalls were another defining feature of the Victorian street scene. They appeared on corners before dawn, catering to labourers heading to factories and dockyards. These stalls were simple setups, usually a handcart with a brass urn perched on top, steam wafting into the morning air. For a halfpenny or penny, a bleary-eyed worker could buy a cup of coffee, often heavily watered down and sweetened with molasses. It wasn't cafe quality, but it was hot, and in the freezing fog of London mornings, that was more important than taste. Alongside coffee, stalls often sold bread rolls, boiled eggs, or slices of cake, making them a kind of early fast food breakfast spot. Their convenience made them hugely popular, especially among the city's growing population of night shift workers who needed sustenance at odd hours. These stalls blurred the line between necessity and indulgence, providing affordable comfort in a city that rarely paused. Critics, of course, sniffed at both ginger beer and coffee stalls. Reformers worried about the alcohol content of ginger beer leading children astray, while moralists fretted that lingering at coffee stalls encouraged idleness or even petty crime. Yet their popularity never waned. For many Londoners, these beverages weren't luxuries, they were part of the daily rhythm of survival. In the clamour of Victorian streets, drinks on the go gave the city its pulse. Sharp, hot, fizzy, and endlessly flowing. If you closed your eyes in Victorian London, you could still tell where you were, not from the clatter of carriage wheels or the foghorns on the Thames, but from the voices of the street vendors. Their cries were the soundtrack of the city, cutting through the fog and coal smoke, announcing food with rhymes, songs, and shouts that were as distinctive as the flavours they sold. Vendors competed fiercely for attention. A pie seller might bellow, "Pie's all hot, piping hot," while a chestnut hawker sang out in sing-song, "Chestnuts all warm and ready." These weren't just advertisements. They were performances, honed over years until the very sound became associated with the food. Londoners didn't just hear words, they heard melodies that stirred hunger. Children would rush toward the familiar cry of the ice cream man, while tired workers perked up at the booming call of the coffee stall keeper. Each vendor had their own style. Some used humour, poking fun at customers or rivals. Others relied on rhythm, repeating phrases like chants until they echoed across alleyways. The best-known cries became cultural markers, noted in newspapers, novels, and even parodies on the music hall stage. Charles Dickens himself often wrote of these cries, understanding that they were inseparable from the city's identity. For the vendors, the cries were survival tools. Competition on crowded streets was brutal, and without a loud, memorable call, a seller could easily be drowned out. A sharp, catchy cry could mean the difference between going home with a pocket of coins or with spoiled goods. Some vendors even hired children to call for them, their high-pitched voices cutting through the din better than adult ones. But the cries were more than business. They created community. Neighbours came to recognise the same vendors passing through at certain times of day, their voices marking the rhythm of daily life. A coffee seller's call at dawn might wake a whole street, while an eelman's evening shout signalled supper time. To modern ears, The endless shouting might sound chaotic, but to Victorians, it was part of the city's living fabric, as essential as church bells or factory whistles. The cries of street vendors turned London's sprawling food market into something more than commerce. They transformed it into theatre, memory, and sound, a chorus of survival echoing through cobbled streets. For all its colour and variety, Victorian street food carried a shadow, the very real danger of what you were putting into your mouth. In an age before modern food safety standards, reformers, doctors, and journalists often warned that the city's cheap eats might fill stomachs, but could just as easily spread disease. The problem started with hygiene. Vendors worked outdoors, surrounded by coal soot, horse manure, and industrial smoke. Food was exposed to flies and dust, and many hawkers lacked access to clean water. Coffee stalls often reused the same mugs all day, rinsing them in a single dirty bucket between customers. Penny ice creams, famously served in communal glasses, might pass through a dozen mouths before being wiped with a rag and handed to the next eager child. Then there was adulteration, the art of stretching ingredients to save money. Pies sometimes contained more turnip than meat, if meat appeared at all. Sweets were brightened with toxic dyes like lead chromate or copper sulfate. Bread, though not strictly street food, was often bulked out with chalk or alum, and reformers suspected similar tricks in street snacks. To those already weakened by poverty, such adulteration wasn't just deceitful, it was deadly. Health reformers and social critics seized on these dangers. The press published sensational accounts of what might lurk inside a penny pie, with tales of horse meat, or worse, cats and dogs, being minced into fillings. While some of these stories were exaggerated, they reflected genuine anxieties about the murky origins of street food. Reformers like Henry Mayhew, who chronicled London's poor, painted vivid pictures of vendors scraping by, often forced to cut corners simply to survive. Yet despite the warnings, street food thrived. For the poor, it remained indispensable. A steaming plate of eels or a handful of chestnuts was better than nothing, and for many, there simply was no alternative. Even the middle classes, though wary, indulged in street treats when convenience or nostalgia outweighed fear. In a sense, Victorian street food culture lived in tension between necessity and danger. Reformers may have scolded, but Londoners kept buying, balancing the risk of sickness against the certainty of hunger. It was a gamble played every day, in every alley where smoke curled from a hawker's brazier. Though the cries of hawkers have long faded and the coal braziers are cold, the legacy of Victorian street food still lingers in Britain's culinary culture. What began as survival food for the poor laid the groundwork for traditions that endure today, shaping how London and the nation eats. Take the humble pie. Once the staple of a penny hawker's cart, it evolved into the enduring institution of the pie and mash shop, still found in pockets of London. The jellied eel, born from the necessity of cheap Thames catches, remains a dish tied to East End identity, a taste of heritage rather than desperation. Even the penny ice cream served in shared glasses to grubby children foreshadowed the rise of mass-produced ices that would become a summer staple across Britain. But beyond specific dishes, Victorian street food left a deeper imprint. It introduced the idea of convenience food. The concept that you could buy a hot meal quickly and cheaply without entering a tavern or waiting for table service was revolutionary. It created a rhythm of eating on the go that echoed into the 20th century with fish and chip shops, cafes, and eventually the fast food industry. The streets of Victorian London were, in a sense, the birthplace of modern grab-and-go dining. The legacy is also cultural. Street vendors, with their cries and rhymes, gave London its soundtrack, embedding food into the city's identity. Writers like Dickens immortalized them, capturing how street food was inseparable from the experience of urban life. To read about Victorian London without its hawkers would be like imagining the city without its fog or its cobblestones. At the same time, the health concerns that plagued Victorian street food spurred lasting change. Scandals about adulterated sweets and unsafe practices eventually pushed governments to enact food safety laws, laying the foundation for modern consumer protections. The tension between necessity, pleasure, and safety that defined Victorian street eating remains relevant today in debates over processed foods, additives, and fast food culture. In the end, Victorian street food was more than sustenance. It was survival, community, theatre, and tradition rolled into one. Its flavours fed a city in transition, and its legacy continues every time Londoners grab a hot snack on the move. The streets may be quieter now, but echoes of those vendors still haunt the modern marketplace, reminding us that even the simplest foods can shape history. The story of the California Gold Rush begins quietly, almost accidentally, in January of 1848. James Marshall, a carpenter overseeing construction at Sutter's Mill along the American River, spotted something glinting in the water. At first, it seemed trivial, just another oddity in the stream. But the word gold spread like wildfire, and what started as a whisper in a sawmill town exploded into one of the most frenzied migrations in history. By the summer of 1848, California, still technically a remote territory, was swarming with prospectors. Local rumors quickly traveled across the continent, carried by sailors, merchants, and letters that made their way east. Newspapers seized on the story, promising fortunes waiting just beneath the soil. By 1849, the trickle of fortune seekers had swelled into a tidal wave. They came to be known as the 49ers, an unlikely army of farmers, adventurers, labourers, and dreamers who packed their belongings and set out for the West. They came from everywhere. Americans trekked overland in covered wagons, braving deserts and mountains. Ships set sail from Latin America, Australia, and even China, crammed with passengers willing to gamble everything on a chance at riches. San Francisco, a sleepy settlement of a few hundred, transformed almost overnight into a roaring boomtown, bursting with tents, saloons, and makeshift shops. Its harbour clogged with abandoned ships, their crews having deserted to chase gold upriver. Yet, the rush was never just about shiny nuggets. People carried with them recipes, tools, and traditions that collided in the rugged frontier. Alongside the gold pans came Dutch ovens, rice cookers, and coffee pots. Every miner needed food, and every boomtown needed cooks, bakers, and brewers. Almost instantly, a new food culture emerged, improvised, chaotic, and nothing like the polished refinement of Victorian dining rooms back east. The dream of instant wealth drove thousands west, but reality set in quickly. Striking it rich was rare. Striking it hungry was inevitable. With so many mouths to feed and so little infrastructure, California became a land of shortages, sky-high prices, and culinary improvisation. To understand the gold rush is to understand not only the fever for riches, but also the daily struggle to eat, cook, and survive in a world where civilization itself seemed half-built. The rush for gold had begun, but so too had the scramble for food. The dream of golden fortunes quickly collided with the reality of eating like a prospector. In the mining camps of California, meals were less about taste and more about survival. The frontier diet was crude, repetitive, and for many, downright depressing. Food shortages were constant, prices astronomical, and preparation often as rough as the men themselves. At the core of a miner's diet was flour. It was the building block of everything from flapjacks fried on a skillet to rough loaves of bread baked in Dutch ovens buried under hot coals. Flour was precious, so much so that a single barrel could cost its weight in gold, literally. Next came beans. Dried, salted, and endlessly boiled, they filled bellies without emptying too many purses. Coffee, usually bitter and burnt, was the lifeblood of the camps, gulped down by lantern light before long days of digging and panning. But variety was rare. Fresh vegetables and fruit were nearly impossible to come by in the early years, especially in remote camps. Miners often went weeks without anything green on their plates. Scurvy, the dreaded disease caused by lack of vitamin C, haunted the camps, leaving men with bleeding gums and aching joints. When lucky, prospectors might find onions or potatoes shipped in at outrageous prices. When not, they made do with salted pork or dried fish, foods that travelled well but offered little comfort. Cooking itself was usually a group affair. Camps pooled resources, and one unlucky soul was designated as the cook, often chosen not for talent, but for losing a bet or drawing the short straw. Meals were slung together quickly, with little care for refinement. A miner might eat beans for breakfast, bread and beans for lunch, and, if fortune smiled, beans with a scrap of pork for dinner. Complaints were common, but with energy needed for backbreaking labour, calories mattered more than taste. Yet even amid the monotony, food revealed the harshness of the frontier. Every cup of coffee, every spoonful of beans, carried the weight of scarcity and improvisation. For men who had crossed deserts, oceans, and mountains chasing gold, eating was no feast. It was a daily reminder that in California, survival came before fortune. If digging for gold was backbreaking, paying for food was gut-wrenching. The California Gold Rush created one of the most chaotic food economies in American history, where scarcity and opportunity collided in spectacular fashion. Miners might not strike a vein of gold, but merchants selling flour, bacon, and eggs often became wealthier than the men in the rivers. The problem began with numbers. Tens of thousands poured into California almost overnight, but farms, mills, and supply chains simply didn't exist on a scale to support them. Every bag of flour, every barrel of beans had to be shipped overland across the Rockies or around Cape Horn on a months-long sea voyage. By the time it reached the mining camps, prices had skyrocketed. Reports from the early years tell of staggering costs. A single egg could fetch up to $1, equivalent to more than $30 today. Potatoes, onions, or apples, when they appeared, were treated like treasure, sometimes sold at auction to the highest bidder. Coffee was so expensive that some camps reused grounds multiple times, each brew weaker than the last. A loaf of bread might cost a fortune in gold dust, and fresh butter was almost mythical outside of San Francisco. The shortages shaped the very character of mining diets. Many miners subsisted on monotonous rations of beans, bacon, and bread, not out of preference but necessity. When supplies ran low, some turned to desperate measures, trading tools or even clothing for a few pounds of flour. Others relied on hunting and fishing, though over time even wild game grew scarce as thousands competed for the same resources. Meanwhile, the scarcity created a new kind of prospector, the entrepreneurial cook and merchant. Savvy individuals realized that feeding miners was often more profitable than mining itself. Camp cooks set up rough taverns, selling simple meals at outrageous prices. Entrepreneurs hauled food into camps with mule trains, charging what the market would bear, and the market would bear almost anything. The result was a frontier economy where food, not gold, was sometimes the most valuable currency. Food shortages turned every meal into a gamble. Would you spend your dust on a real dinner, or save it for supplies to keep digging? In a land built on dreams of riches, hunger reminded everyone that fortune meant little if you couldn't afford to eat. The gold rush wasn't just an American story, it was global. By 1850, San Francisco and the mining camps were melting pots, crowded with fortune seekers from Mexico, Chile, Peru, China, Australia, and Europe. They didn't just bring picks and shovels. They carried recipes, cooking techniques, and flavors that transformed frontier eating into something far more diverse than beans and bacon. One of the most visible influences came from Latin America. Chilean and Mexican miners introduced dishes built around beans, tortillas, and spiced meats. Chili peppers, virtually unknown in Anglo-American cooking at the time, found their way into stews and sauces, offering fiery relief from the monotony of boiled beans. Tamales, corn dough stuffed with meat wrapped in husks and steamed, became a common sight, sold in towns and mining camps alike. Then came the Chinese immigrants, who arrived by the thousands in the early 1850s. They brought with them rice, soy sauce, dried mushrooms, and techniques for stir-frying and steaming. In a region starved for variety, Chinese cooking stood out for its flavor and ingenuity. Their ability to make satisfying meals from meager supplies impressed even skeptical miners. Though discrimination often forced Chinese communities into segregated quarters, their food filtered outward, leaving an indelible mark on California's palate. Europeans added their own touches. Italians baked crusty breads and introduced pasta. French immigrants opened bakeries, bringing pastries and cafe culture to San Francisco. Germans brewed beer and made sausages, offering hearty alternatives to salt pork. Even Australians contributed, drawing on their own frontier experiences to adapt recipes for rugged conditions. What made this food culture remarkable was its improvisation. With supplies scarce and ingredients expensive, immigrants often substituted local products or blended traditions. A Chinese cook might season wild game with soy and ginger. A Mexican miner might use California corn to press tortillas. What emerged was not a faithful reproduction of Old World cuisine, but a rough and ready hybrid suited to the gold rush environment. These culinary exchanges softened the harshness of frontier life. They offered moments of comfort and cultural pride, reminders of home in a strange and often hostile land. More importantly, they laid the foundation for California's future as a crossroads of global cuisine. Long before fusion became a culinary buzzword, the miners and migrants of the gold rush were living it. One tamale, one bowl of rice, one loaf of bread at a time. As miners poured into California, rough camps quickly sprouted into bustling towns, and with them came the first true restaurants and saloons of the frontier. For men weary of beans boiled over campfires, these establishments offered not just food and drink, but a taste of civilization, though often at an outrageous price. San Francisco became the epicenter of this new dining culture. By the early 1850s, the once sleepy port had exploded into a booming city filled with eateries catering to every wallet and appetite. At the top end, luxurious restaurants served multi-course meals imported at staggering cost. Oysters from the East Coast, champagne from France, even exotic fruits shipped from Hawaii. For the wealthy few who struck it rich, dining out became a way to display success as much as to sate hunger. But most establishments were far humbler. Saloons dominated the frontier, doubling as restaurants, bars, and social centers. A miner could stumble in after a long day and order a plate of steak, bread, and potatoes, if he could afford it. More often, saloons dished out simple stews, fried fish, or salted pork, washed down with strong whiskey or beer. Meals were quick, loud, and communal, served on long tables sticky with spilled drinks. Prices were notoriously high. A single dinner in San Francisco could cost a miner the equivalent of several days' wages. Yet demand never faltered. After weeks of monotonous camp food, the chance to eat something freshly prepared, and more importantly, to eat in company, was irresistible. Restaurants and saloons became social hubs where men gambled, traded news, and forged partnerships, their conversations fueled by alcohol and the constant dream of striking it rich. Many entrepreneurs realized that feeding miners was often more lucrative than mining itself. Bakers, brewers, and butchers quickly became some of the wealthiest figures in the gold rush economy. Levi Strauss may have made his fortune with denim trousers, but countless others built empires selling bread, beer, or hearty meals to hungry 49ers. These early establishments left a lasting imprint. They set the stage for California's restaurant culture, blending European, American, and immigrant traditions in a chaotic but vibrant scene. In the end, saloons and restaurants were more than places to eat. They were where miners reconnected with humanity, even as the wilderness of the gold rush loomed just beyond the town's edge. While the gold rush is often remembered as a man's world, rowdy saloons, muddy camps, and endless digging, the role of women in shaping food culture was profound. Though few in number compared to men, women found opportunity not in the mines, but in the kitchens, bakeries, and boarding houses that fed the fortune hunters. In many cases, they earned more from cooking than most men did from panning gold. At first, the sheer scarcity of women gave them unique leverage. A woman who could cook a decent meal, bake bread, or wash clothes could command astonishing prices. Boarding houses run by women quickly became havens for miners, desperate for more than beans and bacon. A warm plate of stew, a slice of pie, and the comfort of a clean table offered something money could buy, but only if you found a woman willing to provide it. Many entrepreneurial women seized this chance. Some opened small bakeries, selling bread at premium prices. Others ran kitchens where they served hearty meals to lines of miners, charging in gold dust instead of coins. For them, cooking wasn't just labor, it was enterprise. Instead of sifting riverbeds for flakes of gold, they turned the hunger of thousands into steady profit. Women also brought refinement into the rough frontier diet. They introduced family recipes, pies filled with fruit, or roasts seasoned with herbs. Even small touches like fresh-baked bread or a cup of tea could transport miners back to memories of home. These meals carried emotional weight, offering comfort amid the brutal uncertainty of the mines. The presence of women also reshaped social spaces. Boarding houses run by women were often calmer, cleaner, and more disciplined than rowdy saloons. Meals there had a sense of order, tables set, prayers said, food served with civility. For many men, it was the first taste of domestic life in years, a reminder of the world they had left behind. Though their numbers were small, women's impact was lasting. They not only sustained miners with food, but carved out economic independence in a society that often denied them opportunities. In many cases, it was women's cooking, not gold mining, that built the foundations of stable communities across California. Despite the hardships of the gold rush diet, beans, bacon, and bitter coffee, meals often became the glue that held mining communities together. Around campfires in the Sierra Nevada or in makeshift shacks along the rivers, food wasn't just sustenance. It was conversation, culture, and the one daily ritual that reminded miners they were human in a world consumed by gold fever. Camps were melting pots. Men from every corner of the globe gathered to eat together, and with them came the chance for cultural exchange. A Mexican miner might spice up beans with chili peppers, while a French immigrant showed his companions how to make a simple stew with onions and herbs. Chinese laborers cooked rice alongside dried fish and vegetables, flavors unfamiliar but quickly appreciated by hungry neighbors. These culinary borrowings blurred boundaries, creating hybrid dishes that reflected the diversity of California's population. Communal meals were also practical. Cooking individually wasted scarce fuel and ingredients, so miners often pooled supplies. One man might contribute flour, another bacon, and another coffee, combining their resources into a shared pot. The resulting meal might not have been gourmet, but it built a sense of solidarity in camps where isolation and exhaustion weighed heavily. Food was tied to celebrations too. On holidays like Independence Day or Christmas, miners went to great lengths to prepare feasts. They saved up flour for pies, splurged on scarce meat, or bought luxuries from town to mark the occasion. These meals became emotional anchors, moments when the rough life of mining gave way to laughter, music, and memory. Even in hardship, food could bring joy, or at least amusement. Camp cooks were often the butt of jokes, praised when the beans weren't burned and cursed when they were. Stories circulated of legendary bad cooks whose meals were so foul they drove men back to the mines early. In a strange way, complaining about food became part of camp culture, a shared grumble that reminded everyone they were in the same boat. Ultimately, the act of eating together helped transform a swarm of lonely fortune seekers into something closer to communities. Around campfires and crude tables, the pursuit of gold paused long enough for miners to share not just a meal, but a moment of humanity. For all its tales of abundance, the gold rush also had a darker culinary underside. Hunger was never far away, and where scarcity ruled, exploitation followed. In the scramble to feed thousands, famine, fraud, and adulteration crept into the food supply, turning meals into a gamble as risky as panning for gold. Famine came first. In the earliest months of the rush, California had neither the farms nor the infrastructure to support the tidal wave of people. Ships brought goods from across the globe, but delays, storms, or shortages could leave entire regions of miners without flour, coffee, or meat for weeks. When supplies ran low, desperation set in. Prices skyrocketed, and those with food hoarded it or sold it at extortionate rates. For the poorest, hunger was a constant shadow, gnawing even as they swung their picks. Fraud was a natural byproduct of such conditions. Unscrupulous merchants preyed on desperate miners, selling flour cut with plaster or chalk, coffee mixed with ground acorns, or butter stretched with lard. Salt pork might be half rancid by the time it reached a camp, but it still sold for outrageous sums. Even canned goods, a relatively new invention, were sometimes tampered with. Labels promising oysters or fruit but hiding far less appealing contents inside. Adulteration wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was improvisation, born of necessity. Bakers might stretch bread dough with sawdust or ground beans to make supplies last longer. Brewers diluted beer until it tasted more like bitter water. But whether done out of greed or survival, the result was the same. Meals that left miners sick, angry, or both. These practices didn't go unnoticed. Newspapers in San Francisco published exposés, warning readers of food cheats and urging caution. But for men deep in the hills, far from town markets, there was little choice. If a man was hungry enough, he would eat whatever was set before him, regardless of quality. The dark side of gold rush food culture reminds us that fortune came with risks far beyond the mines. Just as men gambled their lives in collapsing tunnels and raging rivers, they gambled with every meal, hoping the bread wasn't chalky, the beans weren't spoiled, and the coffee wasn't sawdust masquerading as grounds. In a land obsessed with gold, even food became another frontier for fraud. When the frenzy of the gold rush faded in the mid-1850s, many miners left California empty-handed. But the food culture born in those years did not vanish. Instead, it left an enduring legacy that shaped California's culinary identity and even influenced America's broader eating habits. The most immediate impact was economic. Merchants, bakers, brewers, and restaurateurs often became the true winners of the gold rush. Their businesses outlasted the boom, evolving into permanent fixtures in San Francisco and beyond. The idea that feeding people could be more profitable than digging for gold became a lasting lesson in frontier enterprise. California's first successful breweries, bakeries, and restaurants traced their roots back to these early years. Culturally, the gold rush cemented California as a crossroads of global cuisine. Immigrants from Mexico, Chile, China, Italy, France, and Germany had all brought their recipes to the camps and towns. These traditions didn't disappear. They fused, adapted, and became part of California's foodscape. Chinese cooks introduced rice and stir-fry techniques. Mexican miners popularized tamales and chili. Europeans contributed bread, beer, and pastries. The spirit of culinary fusion, now synonymous with California, began with those rough campfire exchanges. The gold rush also introduced the notion of convenience and portability in American food culture. Meals had to be quick, hearty, and able to withstand rough conditions. This emphasis on practicality foreshadowed later American staples like canned goods, diners, and eventually fast food. The frantic, on-the-go lifestyle of the miners helped create a precedent for eating that prioritized speed and sustenance over refinement. Even the darker aspects, fraud and adulteration, spurred change. Scandals about plaster in flour or sawdust in bread eventually led to louder calls for food safety reforms. Though it would take decades, the groundwork was laid for consumer protections that reshaped how Americans trusted what they ate. Most of all, the gold rush's food culture revealed how hunger shaped history just as much as gold fever. The miners who gathered around campfires, sharing beans, bread or tamales, forged communities in a chaotic land. Their improvisation, resilience and cultural exchange became the DNA of California's food identity. Today, when you walk through San Francisco's Chinatown, savor a Mission burrito, or sip a California craft beer, you're tasting echoes of the gold rush. The gold may have been fleeting, but the flavors it unearthed became California's true treasure.